No one told Gia Simone that the East Wing had its own kind of silence, not the ordinary quiet of a large house between tasks, but something pressed, something that had been held down so long it had taken on weight. She had been scrubbing the marble floors for 3 days without hearing a single thing from behind the door at the end of the corridor, the door with no nameplate. The door the senior maid had pointed at on day 1, flat-voiced, the way you point at a scar. That room doesn't exist for you. Clean up to the doorframe. Stop there. Gia stopped there, until the morning her locket wasn't around her neck. She noticed it in the way you notice a missing tooth, reaching for it before she understood it was gone, fingers finding only the hollow of her collarbone. She retraced her steps through 3 rooms before she heard it. A thin, tinkling thread of melody, barely audible, coming from behind the door that didn't exist for her. Her mother's locket, its small music box mechanism, wound tight, singing inside a room she wasn't permitted to enter. She pushed the door open. The boy was sitting cross-legged on the floor, her locket cradled in both hands, his dark eyes enormous. He held it to his ear, the way you hold a shell to hear the ocean, not exploring it, but receiving it. His lips were parted. His whole body had gone utterly, profoundly still, as if the melody had reached inside his chest and taken hold of something that had been thrashing for a very long time. Then his face broke open. Not a polite smile, not the cautious upturn of a child performing for adults. It was the smile of someone returning from somewhere far away, wide-eyed, incredulous, helpless, the smile of a person who had given up expecting joy and just been ambushed by it anyway. Gia's breath caught in her throat. She had been warned this boy didn't smile. She had been warned he didn't look at people. She had been warned about a great many things in this house, and she was beginning to understand that every single warning was actually a grief, wearing authority's clothing. Behind her, a sound she hadn't heard before. Nothing. Not silence. The absence of breathing. She turned. Alexander Buffon stood in the hallway, 300 pounds of reputation, tailored charcoal, and controlled menace, with one hand pressed flat against his own sternum, as though he were trying to hold something in. His jaw was working. His eyes were fixed on his son's face, with the specific, terrible focus of a man watching something he had stopped believing in. He didn't look like the most dangerous man in the city. He looked like a father who had forgotten what his son's face looked like when it was lit from the inside. Neither of them spoke. The locket played its small, ancient melody into the silence between them, and Jeremiah Buffon, who had not smiled in 2 years, not for the specialists or the therapists or the father who would burn the world down for him, tipped his head back and laughed. Tell me where you are listening from in the comments, and hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next story. Let's begin. She was certain she was going to be fired, or that certainty settled into her bones somewhere around 3 in the morning and was still there at 7 when the knock came, not from a maid or a butler, but from the head of household security himself, a broad-shouldered man with a stillness about him that suggested he had delivered worse news than a summons. He told her Mr. Buffon would see her at 8. He didn't say why. He didn't have to. Gia pressed her uniform flat with both palms, checked that the locket was fastened at her collar, and told herself that being fired wasn't the worst thing that could happen to a person. She had been let go before. She knew how it felt. The careful, corporate language, the envelope with 2 weeks' pay, the walk to the bus stop with everything you owned in one bag. She was practiced at it. She could survive it again. The study was nothing like the rest of the house. Where the corridors ran cold and sculptural, calculated to impress, Alexander Buffon's study was worn at the edges, Books pulled and replaced so many times their spines had softened, a desk that had clearly been chosen for use rather than appearance. A single lamp casting amber light across a room that smelled of old paper and something heavier underneath. Something private. He was already seated when she entered, and he did not invite her to sit. He simply looked at her for a long moment, the way a man looks at a problem he hasn't solved yet. Then he asked her where she grew up. The question was so far from what she expected that she answered it honestly before she could think better of it. Foster care, she told him. 4 homes across 2 counties. She had aged out at 18 with a duffel bag and a social security card, and a locket her caseworker had pressed into her hand, the one thing recovered from her mother's apartment after Gia Simone had died of a sudden illness when Gia was 12. He asked about her qualifications. She told him she had none, at least not the kind he was thinking of. She had cleaned houses since she was 19. She knew the difference between marble and limestone, between a smudge and a stain, between surfaces that looked clean and surfaces that were. She did not know anything about autism. She had not read the books or attended the seminars or spent 3 years in a clinical program learning how to reach children like Jeremiah. She was aware, she added quietly, that this was probably why she was standing in front of him. Alexander was quiet for a moment. Then he told her, without particular emotion, that he had paid $400,000 to people with credentials she couldn't pronounce. That he had flown in a specialist from Geneva who spent 6 weeks in this house without producing a single voluntary response from his son. That he had sat in rooms with men and women who carried entire alphabets after their names and watched all of them fail with the professional grace of people who charge regardless of outcomes. A $12 locket, he said, had done in 40 seconds what none of them could do in 2 years. He offered her a live-in position, her own room on the east wing, directly adjacent to Jeremiah's quarters, a salary 5 times what the agency was paying her. The terms were simple, and there was only one condition. Delivered without negotiation or softening, the locket stayed in the house. Not in her possession, not locked away. In the house, available, within reach of Jeremiah if the boy needed it. He would not remove it from her, but he would not allow it to leave. Gia felt the locket against her collarbone like a second heartbeat. She thought about her mother's hands fastening it there. She thought about the bus stop, the duffel bag, the long practice of surviving departures. She thought about Jeremiah's face, that helpless, ambushed smile, and how it had looked like coming home to somewhere you'd never been. She said yes. Her room was small and clean, with one window that faced the garden and a narrow bed with white linens that smelled of cedar. She unpacked in under 10 minutes. Then she sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, or not yet ready for sleep, and opened the locket the way she always did at the end of hard days. Not for comfort exactly, but for proof. Proof that her mother had existed. Proof that she herself had come from somewhere. The photograph was small and faded at the corners. Her mother, younger than Gia was now, laughing at something outside the frame, her head tipped back, her arm looped through the arm of another woman. The other woman was laughing too. She was beautiful, dark-haired, her face turned slightly toward the camera, as though she hadn't quite decided whether to let herself be seen. Gia had looked at this photograph 10,000 times. She had never known who the other woman was. She closed the locket. She lay down. Outside, the estate held its particular silence, pressed and watchful. And somewhere down the hall, but in a room adjacent to hers, a small boy slept with a feeling map he hadn't yet been taught, and a smile no one in this house had seen coming. She started with what she knew, which wasn't much, and built outward from there. Jeremiah did not like sudden sounds. She learned this on the first morning when she dropped a ceramic mug in the kitchen down the hall and heard, through 2 closed doors, the sharp rhythm of his rocking begin. That particular cadence she was already coming to recognize the way you recognize weather changing, a pressure shift before the storm. She did not drop things after that. She moved through his wing of the house the way she had learned to move through every difficult space in her life, slowly, predictably, without surprise. He did not like being looked at directly. She learned this by accident, too, and the way most useful things are learned. She had turned to find him standing in the doorway of his room, watching her wind the locket. And when she met his gaze head-on, he was gone in an instant, door shut, the rocking audible through the wood. After that, she learned to look slightly past him, at the wall behind his left shoulder, until he offered her something more. He was, she came to understand, a person who needed to approach the world on his own terms, in his own time, and every adult in his life had been trying to reach him from the wrong direction. The feeling map was not a clinical invention. It was a desperate one. She found a fabric remnant bin in the back of the estate's supply room, the kind of forgotten corner that exists in every large house, was accumulated over years of projects no one finished, and she pulled swatches until she had 4 she trusted. Silk, cool and sliding, the texture of something good and effortless. Velvet, dense and absorbing, the texture of something heavy that you sank into whether you wanted to or not. Burlap, rough at the edges, the texture of alarm, of something that caught against your skin and wouldn't let go. Corduroy, ridged and firm, the texture of resistance, of a jaw held tight. She mounted them on a piece of backing board she found in the storeroom and labeled each one in large, clear letters, though she suspected the labels mattered less than the materials themselves. She placed the board on the low table in Jeremiah's study at 7 in the morning and sat down on the floor with her back against the wall, not looking at him, not explaining, just present, and wound the locket. The melody rose into the room, thin and certain, and she felt rather than saw Jeremiah move from his position near the window. He settled cross-legged in front of the board. He reached out and touched the silk. Then he sat back, satisfied, as if he had said something complete. She kept her face still. Inside, she felt something enormous and fragile shift. They did this every morning. The locket wound, the melody playing, Jeremiah moving to the board and making his selection with the grave deliberateness of someone filing an official report. The household staff passed the open doorway, with expressions ranging from polite skepticism to undisguised pity. One of the senior maids told her, not unkindly, that the last therapist had used something similar, and that Jeremiah had dismantled the entire apparatus on the 3rd day and arranged the pieces in a perfect circle on the floor, which the therapist had apparently found meaningful, but which had led nowhere. Alexander's head of security, a man named Wren, who carried his authority so quietly it took Gia 3 days to realize he held any, stopped her in the corridor at the end of the first week. He told her, without malice, that Mr. Buffon's patience had a shape to it, that it was not unlimited, and that she should understand the difference between being given an opportunity and being given permanence. She thanked him and continued down the hall. That same afternoon, Jeremiah reached for silk before she even crossed the threshold. His hand found the swatch at the exact moment she appeared in the doorway, as though he had been waiting, as though her arrival was the thing the silk was for. When she left an hour later, she heard, just before the door clicked shut behind her, the soft, deliberate drag of his fingers across velvet. She did not know that Alexander watched the security footage each night. She did not know he rewound the same moments repeatedly, his son's hand moving to silk, unhesitating, certain, or that he sat in the amber lamplight of his study afterward with a glass he increasingly forgot to refill. She did not know that something had cracked open in him the morning after she arrived, something he had spent 2 years successfully suppressing, and that watching his son reach for happiness with the same quiet confidence other children use to reach for toys was costing Alexander Buffon more than anything he had ever paid for. He was not sleeping. He told himself it was the pressure of business, the usual machinery of his world grinding against itself in the dark hours. He did not examine the alternative too closely. Some doors, he had learned, were easier left shut. He was beginning to suspect this one had already opened. It took her 11 days to notice what should have been obvious from the beginning. The fabric swatches were working. Jeremiah was communicating through them with increasing confidence, his selections growing more nuanced, more specific, sometimes combining 2 textures in a way that Gia had begun to interpret as compound feelings, or the way a person might say, mostly fine, but not entirely. This was remarkable. She knew it was remarkable. But she had started to understand that the board was a translation tool, and that the original language, the one Jeremiah actually thought in, was something else entirely. It was the melody. She saw it one morning when the Locket's mechanism wound down mid-session, the small tinkling thread of music simply stopping, the way a held breath releases. And Jeremiah's entire body registered the absence before Gia had even processed it herself. His shoulders rose, his hands stilled over the swatches. He turned his head toward the locket on the table with an expression she could only describe as bereft, the particular grief of someone who has just lost the thread of a thought they needed to follow. She wound it again immediately. He exhaled. His hands returned to the silk. After that, she paid closer attention. The Locket's melody was not background to the sessions. It was the ground itself, the surface everything else was built on. When it played, Jeremiah was present, accessible, oriented toward her and toward the room in a way that no amount of texture or routine alone produced. When it was absent, some part of him was absent too, retreated to wherever he went when the world became too much and too little simultaneously. She began to hum it. Not deliberately at first. It surfaced the way melodies do, rising from some layer of memory below conscious thought, her mother's voice beneath her own, the lullaby that had accompanied 10,000 ordinary moments of her childhood before childhood ended. She was reorganizing the bookshelf in the corner of the study when she realized she was humming, and she turned to find Jeremiah watching her. Not past her, not through her, at her, with the quality of attention he usually reserved for the Locket itself. She kept humming. He kept watching. And then, with the gravity of a formal decision, he crossed the room and sat down directly in front of her, closer than he had ever voluntarily positioned himself to another person, and closed his eyes. She hummed the lullaby through twice, then a third time. His breathing slowed and deepened until it resembled the breathing of sleep, though he was entirely awake, and she had the distinct impression she was watching someone find a room they had been locked out of for a very long time. She did not hear Alexander in the doorway, or she rarely did. He had a way of arriving without announcement, drawn to these sessions by something he hadn't named and didn't discuss. She only knew he was there when his hand closed around her arm. Not roughly, but with the abrupt certainty of a man who has just heard something that stopped his heart. She turned. His face had gone the color of old ash, all the controlled authority drained out of it in an instant, replaced by something raw and disoriented, the expression of a person who has stepped through a door expecting one room and found another entirely. "Where did you learn that?" he said. It was not entirely a question. Gia felt the grip on her arm and kept her voice level. Her mother, she told him. Gia Simone had sung it to her since before she could remember. She didn't know the language. She had never known the language. It was simply the song her mother sang. Alexander's hand released her. He looked at her for a moment longer with that stripped, disoriented expression, and then he walked away down the corridor without another word, without explanation, without the controlled composure he wore in every other interaction she had witnessed. He simply left, and the space where he had been standing felt altered, as though the air itself was still adjusting. She did not sleep well that night. Near midnight she heard it, faint, filtering through the walls and corridors from somewhere in the main house. A piano played haltingly, with the careful tentativeness of someone reconstructing something from memory rather than reading it from a page. The melody moved through the dark in fragments, repeating, correcting itself. Though reaching for notes, it almost missed, and finding them again. Her mother's lullaby, in the hands of Alexander Buffon, in the middle of the night. Gia stood in the corridor outside the drawing room for a long time without opening the door. She listened to the melody repeat and recover and reach, and she felt something she had no clean name for, a certainty settling into her chest like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known was there. She did not believe in accidents exactly, but she had never believed in anything else. Standing in the dark outside that door, she began, slowly and without permission, to reconsider. She told herself she was simply tidying the library. This was not entirely untrue. The library on the estate's second floor was one of the rooms on her weekly rotation, and the high shelves along the east wall had been accumulating a particular quality of neglect, the kind that suggested they hadn't been touched not from oversight, but from intention, from a decision, conscious or otherwise, to leave certain things undisturbed. She brought the rolling ladder and her cleaning cloth and told herself this was maintenance, ordinary and professional, and that she was not looking for anything. She found it on the third shelf from the top, behind a row of encyclopedias that had clearly not been opened in years. A framed photograph, perhaps 10 inches across, lying face down in a thin sleeve of dust. She turned it over. A wedding photograph. Alexander, younger but recognizable, the same set to his jaw, the same quality of contained force, though something in his eyes that day had been permitted to show itself that she had never seen in the man she worked for now. Beside him, a woman in ivory, dark-haired, luminous, her face turned slightly toward the camera with an expression of such uncomplicated joy that it read almost like a different emotional language than anything Gia had encountered in this house. She recognized her immediately, not from the wedding dress or the setting or the man beside her, from the turn of her head, from the way her chin lifted when she laughed, from the particular quality of her presence in a photograph, the sense that she had decided at the last moment to let herself be fully seen. Gia's hands were shaking before she understood why. She set the frame down on the library table and opened the locket with fingers that did not feel entirely steady, and she held the two photographs side by side in the amber light of the reading lamp. Her mother, young and laughing, arm looped through the arm of the dark-haired woman. The dark-haired woman, years later, in a wedding dress beside Alexander Buffon. The same woman. Decades apart, in two different lives, in two photographs that had never been meant to exist in the same room. Gia sat down because she needed to. She had spent 24 years carrying a photograph of her mother, standing beside a stranger. She had studied that stranger's face in the dark of a dozen different rooms, in a dozen different houses, and wondered, with the low-grade wondering of someone who has learned not to expect answers, who she was and what she had meant to Gia Simone, and why there was no name written on the back. And now she was sitting in Alexander Buffon's library, holding the answer in both hands, and the answer was so large and so impossibly structured that she couldn't find the edges of it. Jeremiah's mother. That was who had been standing beside her mother. The two women had been friends, not acquaintances, not colleagues, but friends, the arm-looped, laughing kind, the kind who sang each other lullabies across whatever distance separated their lives until the distance became permanent. Gia thought about telling him. She constructed the conversation in her mind with the careful architecture of someone who has learned that words, once released, cannot be recalled. She imagined sitting across from Alexander in his worn study and explaining that the photograph in her locket had been solved, that the mystery of the melody had a source, that her mother and his wife had loved each other in some chapter of their lives that neither of them had ever spoken about to their children. She imagined how it would look, a woman with no family and no credentials who had arrived in his house without warning and slipped past every barrier he had erected around his son, now producing a photograph of his dead wife and claiming their mothers had been friends. She could hear the shape of his silence. She could see the controlled, terrible quality it would take on. She had spent enough of her life being the person who looked suspicious simply by existing in spaces she wasn't expected to occupy, and she understood, though with a clarity that was almost cold, that the truth in this instance had the precise dimensions of a lie. She closed the locket. She replaced the wedding photograph face down on its shelf in its sleeve of dust and climbed down the ladder and finished cleaning the room. That afternoon, in the study, she wound the locket and sat with Jeremiah and said nothing about any of it. The session began as it always did. Melody rising, Jeremiah settling, the feeling map waiting on the low table between them. He touched silk, as he nearly always did when she arrived, with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone filing an accurate report. Then something shifted. He looked at the swatch for a moment. Then he picked it up, the entire piece, lifting it free of the board, and stood, and crossed the room, and placed it in Gia's open hand. Now she kept her face still and her breathing even. He went back to the board. He stood before it for a long moment, his hand moving slowly across the remaining textures with unusual deliberateness, as though the selection required more precision than usual. Then he lifted the velvet and brought it to her as well, and placed it beside the silk in her palm, and looked at her with his dark eyes, holding something that was not quite a question and not quite a statement, but existed in the specific register between them, the one they had been building together for weeks. She looked down at what he had given her. Happiness and grief, side by side, in her hand. She understood. She understood exactly. She closed her fingers around both pieces of fabric, and she did not trust herself to speak. So she simply wound the locket again, and let the melody say what neither of them had words for, that some things were both at once, that joy and loss were not opposites, but neighbors, and that sometimes the person who reached you was the same person who reminded you, without meaning to, of everything you were still missing. She noticed him on the fourth day. Not because he announced himself or made any sound, but because Jeremiah did, a subtle recalibration, a slight straightening of the boy's posture that Gia had come to understand as his way of registering a presence he trusted. She kept her eyes on the feeling map and continued humming, and in her peripheral vision she was aware of the shadow falling across the corridor just beyond the open doorway, the particular stillness of a large man holding himself carefully in place. Or she said nothing. She did not look up. She understood instinctively that acknowledging him would end it, that Alexander Buffon had arrived at this doorway through some private negotiation with himself that had cost more than it appeared, and that the terms of his being here required the fiction that he had not quite arrived at all. So she let him stand there. And she kept the sessions exactly as they were, the locket wound, the melody rising, Jeremiah moving through his quiet communications with the board, and she waited to see what Alexander would do with the permission she had not technically given him. He came back the following morning, and the one after that. On the third day, she moved a chair. Done nothing dramatic, simply repositioned one of the low reading chairs from its place against the far wall to a spot nearer the center of the room, angled slightly toward the doorway, as though it had been moved for practical reasons, having nothing to do with the man who stood outside it. She placed a fabric swatch on the seat. Silk, folded in a small square, sitting on the cushion with the casualness of something forgotten rather than arranged. She watched Jeremiah clock the change immediately. He noticed everything, catalogued everything, and deviations from established pattern registered on him, the way sounds registered, as information requiring assessment. He looked at the chair for a long moment. Then he looked at Gia. She kept her gaze at the middle distance, humming, giving him nothing that constituted instruction. Whatever he decided about the chair was his to decide. He left it alone that day. And the next. But he looked at it each session with the careful attention he gave to things he hadn't yet resolved, and Gia understood he was not ignoring it, but considering it, turning it over in whatever interior space he used for problems that required more time than most people allotted them. On the sixth evening, the light was different, late and amber, the kind that arrived in autumn through west-facing windows and made everything feel slower, more considered. Alexander was in the doorway earlier than usual. Jeremiah was at the feeling map, and the session had reached that particular quality of settled quiet that Gia had come to think of as its deepest register, the place where the boy was most fully present, most fully himself. Then Jeremiah stood. He walked to the chair in the center of the room. He picked up the silk swatch with both hands, holding it the way he held the locket, with care, with intention, with the gravity of someone transporting something that mattered. He turned toward the doorway. He walked to his father. He held the silk up. Alexander looked down at his son's upturned face, and the small square of fabric being offered to him with such complete and uncomplicated certainty, and something happened to his expression that Gia had no name for. It wasn't breaking exactly, because breaking implied something violent. And this was the opposite of violence. It was simply the removal of everything he had been holding in place for a very long time, falling away all at once, quietly, like a coat sliding from a chair. He went down to his knees on the hardwood floor. He took the fabric from Jeremiah's hands, and then he gathered his son against his chest, slowly, giving the boy every opportunity to resist or retreat, and Jeremiah did neither. He leaned in. His small hands found the lapels of his father's jacket and held on, and Alexander pressed his face into his son's hair and stayed there, motionless, in the amber light, as though he had finally reached the shore of something he had been swimming toward for 2 years without knowing if it existed. Gia had already stepped back into the corner. She pressed her shoulders against the wall and looked at the ceiling and breathed very carefully through her nose, which did not prevent the tears from arriving. Silent, unstoppable, entirely beyond her management. She was not crying for them exactly. She was crying for herself, for the recognition spreading through her chest like light through a cracked door, warm and terrible and irrefutable. She had spent her entire life loving things she could pack into a bag, things she could carry out without looking back, That would fit through any exit that required no permanence and promised none. She could not pack this. She could not carry it anywhere. It was already too large, too rooted, too much hers in the way that the most dangerous things always were. Not because they had been chosen carefully, but because they had arrived before she could think to refuse them. She looked at the man on his knees, and the boy in his arms, and she understood with the quiet devastation of a person receiving news they already knew that she had stopped being a visitor in this house without noticing the moment it happened. The man who watched the Buffon estate from a distance did not look like someone who watched anything. That was, of course, the point. Felix Cora had spent 11 years as a private investigator, and before that, 7 more in an occupation he did not list on any document, and the skill that had kept him employed and breathing through all of it was the same skill that made him invisible at the corner table of the cafe across from the estate's service entrance. He looked like a man with nowhere particular to be, which was the most useful thing a person could look like in his profession. He had been retained 3 weeks ago by a man he knew only by reputation and by the particular quality of stillness that very dangerous people cultivated, the way certain animals went quiet when they were deciding. The instructions had been precise. Background on the Maid, everything available, quietly. Felix Cora was very good at quietly. The man who had retained him was not watching the estate himself. He didn't need to. Aldrich Solon, known in the overlapping world he occupied by a name he had not been born with and would not be buried under, had other sources, and had been receiving their reports for months with the patient accumulation of a man who understood that leverage was not found, but grown, tended in the dark, until it was ready. The report that had finally drawn his full attention arrived on a Tuesday evening in an unmarked envelope delivered by a kitchen worker named Pell, who had been in Aldrich's quiet employ for 14 months, and who understood the terms of that arrangement with crystalline clarity. Pell's note was brief. The maid Alexander had installed on the east wing had become something more than a maid. The boy had responded to her in ways no professional had achieved. Alexander reviewed security footage nightly. He had stopped his customary evening meetings on 3 separate occasions to be present in the house during her sessions with the child. He had been seen, by Pell, on his knees in a corridor, and the maid had been crying in a corner, and the boy had been held, and the whole scene had the terrible soft quality of something healing. But Aldrich read this report twice. Then he set it face down on his desk and looked out the window for a long time. He was not a sentimental man. He had no particular investment in the grief of Alexander Buffon's son, or the source of its partial resolution. What he had was an instinct, honed by decades of navigating a world built on pressure points, that a man who had been emotionally impermeable for 2 years and had now located something to lose was an entirely different kind of opponent. More dangerous in some respects, considerably more vulnerable in others. He called Felix Cora and told him to go deeper. The trail of Gia Simone was not difficult to follow, for a man who knew which doors to open and which records predated, therefore required physical retrieval from archive facilities, where the overnight staff were modestly paid and not unreasonably persuaded. Felix worked for 9 days and assembled what he found with professional thoroughness, including the parts that surprised him. There were letters, not many, 7, recovered from a storage facility where Gia Simone's few possessions had been kept after her death and never claimed, because there was no one to claim them. They were addressed to a woman identified only by a first name that meant nothing to Felix, until he cross-referenced it against the estate's records and understood what he was looking at. The letters were personal, warm, confiding. the correspondence of two women who had known each other in the unguarded way that friendship sometimes achieves before life intervenes. Some contained references to the writer's circumstances, to difficulties, to things she was afraid of. Some contained references to the recipient's circumstances that were, in context, potentially significant. Felix photographed everything and delivered it to Aldrich without interpretation. Interpretation was not his work. Aldrich's interpretation was swift and architectural. The letters were largely innocent. He recognized this immediately. But innocence and the appearance of innocence were different materials entirely, and a skilled hand could work with either. He spent an evening with a trusted associate who understood document construction, and by the following morning, the dossier existed in its final form, a mixture of genuine record and careful addition, assembled with the seamless confidence of a forgery that knew it would only need to hold for one conversation. The timing required precision. Alexander's territorial negotiation with the northern families was scheduled for the following month, a meeting that had been 3 years in structuring, and that required Alexander to enter the room as a man in complete control of his house, his mind, and his considerable capacity for cold decision-making. A man managing an emotional crisis would be a different negotiator entirely. A man who had just discovered that the person closest to his son's recovery might be a planted infiltrator, to carrying a photograph of his dead wife and a history of convenient access. That man would arrive at the table diminished, reactive, stripped of the composure that constituted his primary advantage. Aldrich sealed the dossier and set it aside with the care of someone placing a tool back in its case after confirming it was ready. He was a patient man. He had waited this long. He could wait 3 more weeks for the precise moment when Alexander Buffon's world was most required to be steady, and hand him instead the thing most likely to make it shake. The meeting had been arranged as a courtesy, which meant it was neither courteous nor a meeting in any ordinary sense. It was a delivery, dressed in the language of diplomacy. But they sat across from each other in a private room above a restaurant that served as neutral ground by long-standing convention. A geography of truce that both men understood was provisional and entirely dependent on the behavior of whoever sat down with less to lose. Aldrich Solon arrived first, which was intentional. He was composed, well-dressed, and possessed of the particular ease that belongs to men who have already decided how a situation will end. Alexander arrived knowing something was wrong. He had known it from the moment the meeting was proposed. The framing had been too careful, the stated agenda too thin, the whole structure of the invitation carrying the faint smell of prepared ground. He sat down with his hands loose on the table and his face giving nothing, which was the only armor he trusted in rooms like this one. That they spoke about the negotiation for 11 minutes. Aldrich was thorough and apparently genuine, raising procedural points that required real engagement, and Alexander gave him that engagement with the focused patience of a man who had not yet shown his hand because he had not yet seen the other. Then Aldrich reached into the leather case beside his chair and placed a manila folder on the table and slid it across with the unhurried confidence of a man serving a course he had prepared carefully and was certain of. Alexander looked at it. He opened it. He read without expression, which cost him more than it had ever cost him to maintain composure in any room he could remember. The documents were organized with precision. Background records, a timeline, transcribed correspondence, and at the center of it, reproduced and enlarged, a photograph he recognized immediately, despite never having seen the original. His wife, young and bright-eyed, arm in arm with a woman he did not recognize, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. Below it, a second photograph, the same unknown woman, older, her face visible in profile, inside a small open locket held by a pair of yellow-gloved hands. He turned pages. He read dates. He read a timeline that placed Gia Simone's application to the domestic staffing agency 6 weeks after a surveillance report on the estate's security rotation. He read suggested correspondence between Lena Simone and parties unnamed, referencing details about Alexander's operations that could only have come from inside his world. Or he read the architecture of a conspiracy assembled with enough genuine material to make the fabricated portions invisible. Aldrich watched him read and said nothing until Alexander closed the folder. Then he said, with the measured calm of someone delivering a verdict they had practiced, that Alexander's wife's secrets were walking around his house in a maid's uniform, and that he had let her hold his son. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. Alexander picked up the folder, placed it in his jacket, and stood. He thanked Aldrich for his time in a voice that contained nothing. He walked out of the restaurant and into the car waiting at the curb and sat in the back for the entire drive home with his hands folded in his lap and his jaw set in a way that the driver, who had worked for him for 9 years, recognized and did not comment on. He did not go to her immediately. That was the most frightening thing. Even furious, even hollowed out by what he had read, Alexander Buffon was methodical. He summoned Wren and requested every second of security footage from Gia's first day of employment. He retrieved her original background check and the agency's intake records. He spread everything across his desk beside the dossier and spent 2 hours cross-referencing with the systematic attention of a man who had built an empire on the ability to distinguish genuine threat from manufactured one. The problem was that the dossier was good. Aldrich's associate had been skilled enough to leave the seams invisible and the genuine material, the photograph, the lullaby, and the undeniable connection between Lena Simone and the woman Alexander had buried was real enough to make everything surrounding it feel real as well. The facts aligned, not perfectly, not without gaps, but enough. Enough to plant the question. Enough to make 2 months of careful observation curdle in his memory into something that looked, under this new light, like practiced performance. He thought about Jeremiah reaching for silk. He thought about Jeremiah's hands on his lapels. He thought about the feeling of his son's weight against his chest for the first time in 2 years, and what it would mean if all of it had been constructed by someone who understood exactly which door in this house had no lock. He was at Gia's door before he had fully decided to be there. He opened it without knocking, or she was awake, sitting on the edge of the narrow bed, the locket in her hands, her face unguarded in the way it only was when she believed herself unobserved. She looked up and saw his expression and went very still. He threw the dossier onto the bed beside her. He told her she had 60 seconds to explain why her mother was in a photograph with his dead wife before he did something they would both regret. She did not beg. She did not flinch. She picked up the dossier from where it had landed on the bed beside her, and she read it. Not quickly, not performatively, but with the focused stillness of someone who has learned that the most important thing you can do when the ground shifts is make sure you understand what you are actually standing on. As Alexander stood in the doorway and watched her read, and the quality of his silence was the most dangerous thing in the room. When she finished, she set it down. She looked up at him and said, quietly and without heat, that half of what he was holding was real, and half of it had been constructed specifically to make him destroy the only good thing happening in his son's life. She told him he was smart enough to know the difference. She told him he was simply too scared to trust it. The room changed. It did not get louder immediately. There was a moment of absolute stillness first, the kind that precedes not calm but its opposite, and then Alexander's composure, which had held through the drive home and the 2 hours of footage and the walk down the corridor, but came apart with the force of something that had been compressed past its tolerance. He was not a man who shouted. She understood this about him, which was why the sound of his voice, raised in that small room, felt like a structural event, like something load-bearing giving way. He told her she had lied, not with false documents or fabricated timelines, but with silence, which in his world was its own category of deception, and not a lesser one. He told her she had been in his house for weeks, in his son's life, in the sessions, in the corridor outside the drawing room while he played a melody he had never been able to explain, knowing she carried a photograph of his dead wife against her chest and saying nothing. He told her that whatever her reasons were, whatever she told herself they were, she had made a choice every single day to keep it, and that choice looked exactly like what the dossier said it was. Gia stood. She did not raise her voice to meet his. She told him she had been afraid. She told him she knew precisely how it would look. A stranger arriving with a photograph of his wife, threading herself into his son's trust, producing the connection only after she was established, and that the fear of being seen as exactly what that dossier claimed she was had kept her silent in a way she was not proud of. She told him the connection was real and innocent, and she could not prove it standing in this room at this hour, and she understood that, and she was not going to ask him to take her word for it. She was going to ask him to think about his son. He opened his mouth to respond. The sound came from the doorway. But neither of them had heard Jeremiah's door. Neither of them had heard his footsteps in the corridor. But he was there, small and sleep-soft, his dark hair pressed flat on one side, standing at the threshold of Gia's room, with his eyes wide, and his hands rising slowly toward his ears. His father's raised voice was a sound that belonged to a particular category in the boy's interior taxonomy, one that Gia had never heard from that room, and prayed she never would. And Jeremiah's body knew it before his mind could process the context. He began to rock. Gia went to her knees on the bare floor before the movement was a conscious decision. She lifted the locket from around her neck. Her fingers found the winding mechanism by feel, by the 10,000-time memory of the gesture, and she wound it in the dark with her hands steady, because they had to be, because one of them in this room needed to be steady, and she was the only candidate left. The locket came open. The melody rose. It filled the room the way it always did, thin and certain and unhurried, older than any of them, carrying in its small mechanism something that had survived the deaths of the women who had first passed it, between them like a held hand, across a long distance. Jeremiah stopped rocking. He lowered his hands from his ears. He walked to Gia with the focused deliberateness he brought to everything that mattered, and he took the locket from her open palm and held it to his ear, and closed his eyes. The melody played against his cheek in the silence that had replaced the shouting. Then he opened his eyes and looked at his father. His voice, when it came, was not a word. It was a sentence, full and clear and trembling with the effort of a child reaching across every barrier his grief had built, handing his father something he had been holding alone for a very long time. "She's not bad, Papa. She sounds like Mama." The sentence landed in the room and stayed there. Alexander's face did something she had no name for, and would not have been able to describe afterward. He looked at his son. He looked at the locket pressed against the boy's ear. He looked at Gia on her knees on the floor, and she watched the moment the understanding arrived, not gradually, but all at once, the way a light comes on, the way a key turns, the melody in the locket, the melody his wife had hummed over Jeremiah's crib in the small hours of the morning, or the melody he had played haltingly on the piano in the dark, searching for its origin through years of quiet grief. Gia Simone had not given her daughter a connection to the Buffon estate. She had given her daughter the only piece of the woman she had loved most, a lullaby, passed between friends in some bright, ordinary afternoon decades ago, carried forward in a $12 music box through foster homes and hard years, and a boy's long silence until it arrived, by no conspiracy and no design, in exactly the room where it was needed most. The dossier was still on the bed. It had not changed, but it had become what it actually was. Paper, dressed as truth, built by a man who understood that the most effective weapon against something real was a version of it that looked more plausible. Alexander looked at his son's face for a long time. Then he sat down on the floor of Gia's small room, not in a chair, not against the wall, but simply down on the bare hardwood, as though his legs had made a decision independently of everything else. And he pressed the back of his hand against his mouth and breathed. Jeremiah, still holding the locket, walked to his father and sat beside him. Gia remained on her knees and let the melody play until it wound down on its own, and didn't move and did not speak, and understood that some things could only be witnessed, not explained, not accelerated, or not improved upon by any word she might offer, into the space where a lullaby had just told the truth. The 3 days that followed were quiet in the estate, in the way that the eye of a storm is quiet, a functional calm operating above considerable machinery. Alexander moved through the house with the focused economy of a man who had converted grief into precision, which was, Gia was coming to understand, the only emotional register he entirely trusted. He made calls. He held meetings in his study with men who arrived without appointment and left without conversation. Wren moved through the corridors with a stillness that was different from his usual stillness, purposeful, directed, carrying the particular quality of someone executing instructions that required no improvisation. Gia kept to the east wing. She held her sessions with Jeremiah and wound the locket each morning and let the melody do what it did, and she did not ask questions about what was happening in the rooms she wasn't permitted to see. She already knew the shape of it. She had read the dossier carefully enough to understand what Aldrich Solon had built, and therefore what dismantling it would require, and she trusted that Alexander Buffon had not maintained his position in a world built on leverage and consequence by being anything less than surgical when the situation required it. She heard afterward, through the careful economy of Wren's reporting, that the council had convened on the second day, that Alexander had presented the forged elements of the dossier alongside the genuine records, were laying them against each other with the methodical clarity of a man who has done his homework and intends for that to show, that Pell's cooperation had been secured, and his testimony had confirmed the origin of the internal intelligence, that the council, composed of men who had built their collective order on the understanding that certain lines, children, grief, the weaponization of a father's love for a damaged son, existed precisely because their violation made the entire structure untenable, had reached its conclusion without extended deliberation. Aldrich Solon lost his seat on the third day. His territory followed. His protection, which had been conditional on that seat, dissolved with the efficiency of something that had never been unconditional to begin with. He left the city by the end of the week, and the particular silence his absence created was the silence of a door closing on a matter that was finished. Alexander came home on the evening of the third day and found Gia's bag on the bed. She was folding things into it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had packed under difficult circumstances enough times to have removed all hesitation from the process. She heard him in the doorway and did not stop, She told him, without turning around, that she would not stay in a house where she was not trusted. She told him this without accusation, plainly, the way she said most things, as a statement of fact about herself rather than a verdict on him. He did not argue. He did not reach for his wallet or begin the architecture of an improved contract. While he came into the room and sat down on the floor beside the narrow bed, the most powerful man in the city, in his tailored jacket, on bare hardwood, and he began to talk. He told her about Natalie. Not the version of Natalie that existed in the estate's careful silences and the dust-covered photograph in the library, but the real one, the woman who had hummed a lullaby over Jeremiah's crib in the first months of his life, who had sung it so consistently and with such specific tenderness that the melody had become, for that infant, the sound of safety itself. He told her that after Natalie died, he had searched for the lullaby's origin with the same methodical patience he brought to everything, because understanding it felt like understanding a piece of her he hadn't been given access to, a room in her interior life she had never taken him into. He had found nothing. The melody had no traceable source he could locate. It had seemed to belong entirely to Natalie, to have arrived with her from some place he couldn't reach. He told her that a maid had dropped a locket in his son's room, and the room had given him the answer. He told her that her mother had given Natalie something he had never been able to give her himself, a friendship that existed entirely outside his world, untouched by its darkness, uncomplicated by its demands, a place where Natalie could have been simply herself, before she became his wife and the mother of his son, and the woman who carried the weight of both those things with a grace he had not always deserved. Gia Simone had held that for her. And now, without knowing what she was doing or what house she was walking into, or what thread she was following home, Gia Simone's daughter had given Jeremiah the same thing. He was not asking her to stay as an employee. He was asking her to stay as family. He said the word simply, without ornament, the way a man says a word he has turned over many times before deciding it is the right one. Gia looked down at the locket in her hand, the photograph inside, her mother's face, and beside it, the face of the dark-haired woman she now knew, looked back at her with the particular quality of people captured in a moment of complete happiness, unaware of everything that was coming, unconcerned with it, belonging entirely to the afternoon they were standing in. Two women who had loved each other across every boundary the world had placed between them. Or different lives, different worlds, different endings, and between them, surviving all of it, a song. She put the bag down. The following morning, Jeremiah found her in the study before she had finished winding the locket. He came in without his usual careful assessment of the room, without the measured approach of someone deciding whether the space was safe. He simply arrived, the way he had begun to arrive in recent days, with the ease of a person going somewhere they have already decided belongs to them. He went to the feeling map. He lifted the silk swatch with both hands and brought it to her, placed it in her palm with the grave deliberateness she had loved from the beginning, and went back. He stood before the board for a long moment. His hand moved slowly across the textures, past velvet, past burlap, or past corduroy, to the far corner, where a small square of fabric had been pinned in the earliest days of the map's construction, almost as an afterthought, labelled in her handwriting in letters she hadn't expected him to need for a very long time. Soft white cotton, the texture of ordinary mornings, the texture of a place that asked nothing of you, except that you remain. He lifted it carefully. He carried it across the room and placed it in her palm, beside the silk, and then he closed her fingers around both pieces with his small, certain hands. Happiness and home held together. and looked up at her. His hands moved. The sign she had taught him in the very first week, demonstrated once and never reinforced, the one she had offered the way you plant something without knowing if the ground will hold it. Stay. Gia looked at his face and felt something in her chest complete itself. Not dramatically, not with the force of the moments that had preceded it, but quietly, the way the last piece of a thing settles into place and the whole becomes visible, and you understand that it was always going to look like this, that every room you passed through and every door you left and every morning you woke up alone was simply the long way to the place where you were always meant to arrive. She wound the locket. The melody rose into the room, thin and certain, carrying its two women and its decades and its unbroken thread of love forward into another ordinary morning. She did not leave.